We would like to begin by acknowledging that this film has been produced on the unceded territories of the Squamish people. We are honored to work on this territory. Canada has a colonial history that came from the belief in the racial and cultural superiority of the settlers. This belief in their racial and cultural superiority led to many tools of assimilation. One of these was the Indian residential school system. Residential schools were mandatory for all Indigenous children to attend from the late 1800s until the last one closed its doors in 1996. Residential schools were brutal places run by the churches, mainly the Roman Catholics, and they attempted to assimilate Indigenous children into settler society. Children attended the school from the time when they were 2 years old until they turned 18, and often would not be allowed to see their families for years on end. Physical, mental, and sexual abuse ran rampant, and it is estimated that around 6,000 children died while in the school system. However, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada has said that we will never truly know the amount of deaths that took place because often children were buried in unmarked graves. Residential schools have had a lasting impact on Canada's Indigenous populations. Intergenerational trauma and the cumulative grief, loss, and anger that came from the residential schools has led to cultural disruption, loss of language and culture, and an overwhelming feeling of powerlessness and loss. Canada's government issued an official apology in 2008, but reparations are still ongoing. To explore this further, we interviewed 7 university students on the Squamish territory about their education on the Canadian residential school system.
Yeah, it's something I heard of. Is Indian residential schools the term that is preferred? I was curious about this.
Yes, I do know about residential schools now.
No, I don't know anything about Canadian residential schools.
No, I didn't know anything about residential schools and the concept of them existing.
I was not aware about residential schools in Canada.
Yes, I do know about residential schools.
Yes, I've heard about Canadian residential schools.
The first time I became aware of the residential schools was, I believe it was in the Cornerstone and at Quest, but I didn't really pay much attention to it at first because I thought it was like a small sort of issue. I didn't know it was huge in Canada. And the only time I realized that it was a big issue was in one of the courses in Culture of Self and Society with Elizabeth Lee, where we actually went to a museum where they kind of showed about, stuff about residential schools. It was in Whistler.
It was an interesting story of how I first came upon the notion that residential schools have existed. I first arrived to Vancouver about 2 years ago, and I was very sleep deprived, and getting to Squamish was challenging, but my taxi driver was very talkative and at first it was getting on my nerves, but then I found out that he was of Indigenous descent and that Canada has a long history of people that lived here before the settlers arrived, which I was completely unaware of before coming to Canada.
Yeah, but I don't know how it's taught in schools, and I don't know how it's taught in how it's talked about in different settings. In a typical white Canadian family, if it's mentioned at all or not. So I don't know anything about it.
The first sort of like definite mention of this within a classroom setting would be probably grade 10. My socials 10 class, I think. I remember discussing First Nations. Well, we did a whole bunch of things on First Nations culture and things like that, and it definitely came up at one point. Certainly wasn't the focus of the class though.
I learned about Canadian residential schools in my social studies textbook, which glazed over the fact. I remember learning that they closed in 1996, which was the year I was born. So the last one closed 23 years ago, which is really recent. And I remember pictures and diagrams and fact-based teachings about
the nature of what happened there. Mm-hmm.
When I first became aware of residential schools was my second block in first year at Quest. It was my rhetoric block, and I had a teacher who was a linguist, and so she had us start off the block by learning how to like properly pronounce the local language of the name. I don't know if I can still do it, but it was something that I knew at one point. And throughout the rhetoric curriculum, she had us read sometime during the first week, the Truth and Reconciliation Act, published by the Canadian government. It was pretty thick, it was a full thing, but I thought it was so useful. Obviously upsetting, and being an American, being like, Canada's so much better, and like having this like preconceived notion and getting there and like the second block in, being like, oh my god, was really interesting. The difference of what has happened and what people are actually aware of, at least for me.
I'm not yet sure how to answer it coherently, but it's something that I am keeping in my mind almost at all times, or I try to keep in mind at all times.
Well, I think at first it perhaps goes without saying, but maybe not, that there is a sense of sorrow and guilt to a level about such events that I sort of bear with me. And I think probably the thing that has affected me most about the education that I have received on such an issue is when I encounter people who haven't. Parents of people I know who are very derogatory towards First Nations issues and that sort of thing. There's sort of a culture of that that still exists in a lot of Canadians. And so it makes me more bold and feel both more empowered to take a stand on that sort of thing, using the privilege that I have in that sort of space, and also more urgent that I do so.
One thing that struck me coming here as a white settler from Europe, especially interacting with many other settlers who also in my self-culture and society class, that they all said, oh, we're so surprised that this happened in Canada, because Canada is seen as this country that didn't really do a lot of harm, and we're so shocked this has happened and that the government has done such things. But I never felt that way, because I was like, there's so many things that have happened in the past, and this shouldn't come as a surprise. I think that the more challenging thing is why did it even happen, and not so much the shock moments wasn't very big for me.
I think if it's impacted me in any way, it's made me realize kind of not that how much my experiences don't matter, but how much it matters for me to leave space for those other experiences to be expressed and kind of as furthering said knowledge, and including it in when I critique the academic work that I'm engaging with in class, and kind of bringing up that history and angle to things in class discussion. So yeah, essentially just noticing that it's my job, now that the rug has been lifted back from me, is to do that to others, whilst not projecting my own kind of self-righteous identity into that at the same time. So being aware but not taking over, trying to step up, step back, or that whole proper allyship thing.
I think for settlers to engage in the process and practice of decolonization, first we must talk to our families and talk to ourselves.
Education on the Canadian residential school system and its effects on Indigenous population is still not widespread. We are by no means experts on the system and the policies that led to its creation and eventual destruction. We suggest, if you want to explore further, to check out these resources. Thank you.